December 16th, 1944. The snow-covered forests of the Ardennes region in Belgium and Luxembourg erupted with the thunder of over 2,000 German artillery pieces. Operation Watch on the Rhine, better known as the Battle of the Bulge, had begun. General der Panzertruppe Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, watched his columns of Tiger and Panther tanks roll westward through the pre-dawn darkness with grim satisfaction. His objective was ambitious, perhaps desperately so. Drive 125 miles through Allied lines, cross the Meuse River, and capture the vital port of Antwerp. Success would split the British and American armies, potentially forcing a negotiated peace in the West. But Manteuffel knew something that troubled him deeply. His panzers were rolling forward with barely half their required fuel. The plan depended on capturing American fuel dumps intact. Without those supplies, the offensive would grind to a halt within days, maybe hours. As he studied his maps that freezing morning, Manteuffel reportedly told his staff officers, "We'll soon have their gasoline. The Americans bring everything by truck. They're stretched thin. Once we break through, their supply lines will collapse. We'll be swimming in American fuel by Christmas." The German officers around him laughed, confident in their commander's assessment. They had studied American logistics and found them wanting. Long, vulnerable supply lines stretching hundreds of miles, soft-skinned trucks exposed on open roads, massive fuel dumps guarded by rear-echelon troops. It seemed almost too easy. Within hours, reconnaissance units were radioing back reports of abandoned American supply depots, some still burning, others intact. The laughter in German command posts grew louder. The Americans were running scared, leaving their precious supplies behind. What the German High Command didn't understand, what they couldn't have imagined, was that they were facing the most sophisticated logistics machine ever created. The American supply system that seemed so vulnerable, so chaotic, so wastefully abundant, was actually an expression of industrial and organizational genius that would prove utterly unstoppable. Those fuel convoys the Germans mocked weren't a weakness. They were the iron fist wrapped around Germany's throat, and that fist was about to squeeze. The story of how American fuel logistics defeated the last great German offensive begins not in the Ardennes, but in peacetime America, where a revolution in transportation had created capabilities that Germany couldn't match even in its wildest dreams. Before World War II, the United States had built something unprecedented in human history, a road network spanning millions of miles, connected by standardized fueling stations, maintained by a massive automotive industry, and integrated into an economy where trucks moved more goods than trains. By 1941, America had 32 million vehicles on its roads. Germany had fewer than 2 million. The Soviet Union had barely 700,000. This wasn't just a numerical advantage. It represented a completely different understanding of how mechanized warfare would function. When America entered the war, the military didn't need to create a trucking industry from scratch. It already existed. Companies like General Motors, Ford, and Studebaker were already producing hundreds of thousands of vehicles annually. The challenge wasn't building trucks. It was building enough trucks to support armies on 3 continents simultaneously. The solution was the GMC CCKW, universally known as the Jimmy, and its siblings, a family of 2.5-ton tactical trucks that would become the workhorses of Allied logistics. The design was brilliantly simple: 6-wheel drive for off-road capability, a 270 cubic inch inline-6 engine producing 104 horsepower, a 2-speed transfer case, open cab design for easy maintenance, standardized components that could be swapped between vehicles, and a cargo capacity of 5,000 pounds, though soldiers routinely loaded them with twice that weight. Production began in 1941, and the numbers quickly became staggering. By war's end, over 560,000 Jimmy trucks had been produced. At peak production, the Pontiac and Yellow Coach plants were completing 1 truck every 5 minutes, 24 hours a day. But the Jimmy was just one piece. The United States produced 2.4 million trucks during the war years. 2.4 million! Germany produced 350,000. The Soviet Union, even with American aid, managed barely 200,000. The Americans weren't just winning the truck war. They were playing a different game entirely. Each truck required support, spare parts, maintenance facilities, trained mechanics, fuel, oil, tires. The American logistics system provided all of it. Factory production included complete sets of spare parts shipped with every batch of trucks. Technical manuals were standardized and distributed to every motor pool. Mechanics received training on modular repair techniques that allowed them to swap entire engines or transmissions in hours rather than days. Most critically, the fuel supply chain was designed from the ground up to support this massive mechanized force. The scale of American fuel production was almost incomprehensible. In 1944, the United States produced 1.7 billion barrels of crude oil. 1.7 billion. That's 71 billion gallons. Germany's entire production, including synthetic fuel from coal, barely reached 50 million barrels. The ratio was 34-1. Even accounting for domestic consumption, America could dedicate over 100 million barrels annually to military use without affecting the home economy. This fuel had to reach the front lines. That required a distribution system of unprecedented complexity. At the highest level, tankers brought refined fuel from American refineries to British ports. From there, pipelines and coastal tankers moved it to storage facilities near the embarkation points. After D-Day, the challenge became moving millions of gallons across France to advancing armies. The solution was the Red Ball Express, though that name actually refers to just one of several similar operations. Beginning on August 25, 1944, dedicated truck convoys began running from the Normandy beaches to forward supply dumps near the front lines. At its peak, Red Ball operated 6,000 trucks moving 12,500 tons of supplies daily. The trucks ran 24 hours a day on one-way loop routes. Southbound lanes carried loaded trucks. Northbound lanes brought empties back for refilling. Military police closed the designated roads to all other traffic. Maintenance crews worked around the clock to keep the highways passable. Traffic control points ensured steady flow without congestion. The entire system was orchestrated with precision that would have impressed any factory production manager. The drivers were predominantly African-American soldiers, serving in segregated transportation units. The Red Ball Express offered them one of the few combat-adjacent roles available in the segregated military. They drove through rain, mud, darkness, and occasional German artillery fire, maintaining schedules that kept entire armies mobile. Each driver might cover 300 miles round trip, grab a few hours of sleep and do it again. For 83 days, the Red Ball Express operated continuously, delivering over 400,000 tons of supplies. Roughly 40% of that tonnage was fuel and lubricants. But Red Ball was just the most famous system. The White Ball Express supplied the 12th Army Group. The ABC Express, standing for Antwerp, Brussels, Charleroi, fed armies in Belgium. The Little Red Ball supplied the 9th Army. The Red Lion Express operated in southern France. Each system followed the same principles: dedicated routes, continuous operation, centralized traffic control, and massive throughput. The Germans watched this vast movement of vehicles with a mixture of contempt and confusion. Their own logistics relied heavily on railways, which were efficient but inflexible and vulnerable to air attack. German trucks were a mixture of types. Many requisitioned civilian vehicles with different parts, different fuel requirements, different capabilities. Maintenance was a nightmare. Fuel consumption varied wildly between units. German logistics officers calculated that the American approach was wasteful, all those trucks burning fuel to deliver fuel. It seemed almost paradoxical. They estimated correctly that the American supply system consumed nearly 40% of the fuel it transported just to operate the transportation network. This seemed to prove German efficiency. Their rail-based system used far less fuel per ton-mile delivered. What the Germans failed to understand was that the Americans could afford the inefficiency. The raw numbers were so overwhelming that even wasting nearly half the fuel on transportation still left more combat fuel available than Germany's entire production. Oberstleutnant Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, later wrote in his post-war analysis, "We could not comprehend the American logistics philosophy. They treated fuel and vehicles as infinite resources. When a truck broke down, they pushed it off the road and brought in another. When they needed more fuel, they simply ran more convoys. It defied all principles of military economy. What we failed to recognize was that their economy operated on a scale that made our principles irrelevant. The fuel itself was another American advantage rarely discussed. The United States produced primarily high-octane aviation gasoline through advanced catalytic cracking processes. This fuel could power trucks, jeeps, tanks, aircraft, everything. Germany struggled with multiple fuel types. Standard vehicles used low-grade gasoline. Aircraft required higher-octane fuel. Diesel engines needed yet another fuel type. This complicated logistics immensely. A fuel convoy might need to carry multiple segregated loads. The Americans simplified everything. One fuel type for nearly everything except diesel vehicles, which used standardized fuel oil. When you captured an American fuel dump, you got fuel that would run all your vehicles. This standardization extended to containers. The American military used standardized 5-gallon jerry cans, actually copied from a German design, and 55-gallon drums. Both were rugged, stackable, and easy to handle. A 2.5-ton truck could carry 80 jerry cans or 40 drums, delivering 400 or 200 gallons respectively. More importantly, these containers could be stockpiled anywhere. A fuel dump didn't need special equipment. Just open ground, some camouflage netting and guards. This allowed rapid establishment of forward supply points as armies advanced. By December 1944, the American logistics system in Europe had reached maturity. The port of Antwerp, captured in September but only opened to shipping in late November after the Scheldt estuary was cleared, could handle 10,000 tons daily. Pipeline systems were extending eastward behind the advancing armies. The Big Inch and Little Big Inch pipelines, each capable of moving millions of gallons daily, were being extended from the coast toward the German border. Fuel storage capacity behind Allied lines exceeded 100 million gallons. Daily consumption was running about 800,000 gallons for all armies combined. The German planners studying this system before launching the Ardennes offensive saw apparent vulnerabilities. The fuel dumps were huge, visible from the air and lightly guarded. The truck convoys followed predictable routes. The pipeline system was above ground in many places, vulnerable to sabotage. Breaking through the American front lines would give German spearheads access to all of it. The plan specifically identified American fuel dumps as priority objectives. Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, received explicit orders to capture fuel supplies intact and refuel from American stocks. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, commanding the Kampfgruppe, was confident. His force of 4,800 men and 100 armoured vehicles, including massive King Tiger tanks, would smash through the American lines at their weakest point, then race westward, living off captured American supplies. The Panzers started the offensive with barely enough fuel to reach the Meuse River, maybe 90 miles. But Peiper had maps showing American fuel dumps every 10 to 15 miles along his planned route. He told his officers, "The Americans are so rich they leave their fuel sitting by the roadside. We'll fill our tanks from their dumps and be in Antwerp before they realise we've broken through." The initial assault succeeded beyond German expectations. The surprise was complete. American units reeled backward in confusion. Kampfgruppe Peiper broke through and raced westward, their tracks chewing up the frozen roads. Within 24 hours, they had penetrated 20 miles. Within 36 hours, they reached Stavelot, where intelligence indicated a major American fuel dump containing over 2 million gallons. As Peiper's lead tanks approached Stavelot, his crews could see the fuel dump. Thousands of 55-gallon drums stacked in neat rows, jerry cans by the thousands, enough fuel to power their drive all the way to the coast. The Panzer crews were celebrating, already planning how they'd organize the refueling. Then they saw the smoke. American defenders pulling back through Stavelot had set the fuel dump ablaze. The entire facility, 2.5 million gallons of gasoline, transformed into a roaring inferno. The heat was so intense that Peiper's tanks couldn't approach within 200 yards. Black smoke rose thousands of feet into the winter sky, visible for miles. The flames would burn for 3 days. Peiper was furious, but not yet concerned. Intelligence showed more dumps ahead. His panzers pushed westward. At Trois Ponts they found another dump, also destroyed. At L'Église, another, also burning. At every location, American engineers had denied them the fuel they desperately needed. What Peiper didn't know, what no German commander understood, was that American logistics included detailed demolition plans for every supply point. Each dump had demolition charges pre-positioned and guards with specific instructions. If overrun, destroy everything. Don't try to evacuate, don't try to defend, just burn it. The American logistics officers had calculated that they could afford to lose entire dumps. Production and transportation capacity would replace the losses within days. What they couldn't afford was letting German panzers refuel from American stocks. By December 19th, 4 days into the offensive, Kampfgruppe Peiper was stalled near La Gleize out of fuel. Their tanks, the most powerful armoured vehicles in the world, sat immobile. Peiper requested emergency fuel drops from the Luftwaffe. A few aircraft attempted delivery, but Allied air superiority meant most were shot down before reaching the drop zones. On December 24th, Peiper abandoned his vehicles and led his remaining men on foot back to German lines. Behind him sat 40 tanks and assault guns, undamaged but useless without fuel. The pattern repeated across the entire offensive front. German spearheads would advance until their fuel ran out, then sit helplessly as American forces counterattacked. The 2nd Panzer Division reached Celle, just 4 miles from the Meuse River, then ground to a halt, tanks empty. The Panzer-Lehr Division advanced 25 miles before running dry. The 116th Panzer Division made it 30 miles. None achieved their objectives. All were eventually destroyed or forced to retreat, abandoning their vehicles for lack of fuel. Meanwhile, the American response demonstrated everything the Germans had misunderstood about Allied logistics. Within 48 hours of the German attack, Patton's Third Army, operating 100 miles south of the breakthrough, executed a 90-degree pivot and began driving north to strike the southern flank of the German penetration. This manoeuvre required moving over 250,000 men and 50,000 vehicles through winter weather on secondary roads. It should have been impossible. It required fuel deliveries of staggering proportions. Patton's army was consuming over 300,000 gallons daily during the movement. The fuel arrived on time, every day, without fail. The Red Ball Express and supporting supply systems simply shifted routes and increased runs. Tanker trucks that had been supplying the 1st and 9th Armies were redirected to 3rd Army supply points. Within a week, the entire supply network had reoriented to support the counterattack. German intelligence officers monitoring American radio traffic couldn't believe what they were hearing. Units reporting full fuel loads, requests for ammunition and food, but rarely fuel. Tank battalions launching attacks with enough fuel for extended operations, not just desperate last-ditch advances. On December the 26th, the 4th Armoured Division, spearheading Patton's relief of Bastogne, covered 70 miles in 24 hours through snow and German resistance. This advance required each tank to carry maximum internal fuel plus external jerry cans, consuming perhaps 150 gallons per vehicle. With over 200 tanks in the division, that's 30,000 gallons for the day's advance. The fuel was there, delivered by truck convoy through weather that grounded most aircraft. The American supply system didn't just survive the crisis, it thrived. By early January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was effectively over. The German offensive had created a salient 50 miles deep and 70 miles wide at its maximum extent. Then it collapsed, not because German soldiers stopped fighting, but because German tanks stopped moving. Post-battle analysis revealed that over 600 German armoured vehicles were abandoned in the Ardennes, most for lack of fuel. Many were undamaged, simply out of gas. American recovery teams collected them, fueled them from American dumps and used them for training or testing. The fuel consumption statistics from the Battle of the Bulge illustrate the disparity. The German offensive, involving approximately 250,000 men and 1,400 armoured vehicles, consumed roughly 5 million gallons of fuel over the month-long operation. Most of that was used in the first week. By the second week, many German units were rationing fuel, limiting movement to absolute necessities. By the third week, fuel shortages were critical across the entire front. The American response, involving over 600,000 men and 3,000 armoured vehicles, consumed approximately 50 million gallons over the same period, 10 times the German consumption, and the Americans never rationed, never limited operations for lack of fuel, never left vehicles immobile due to empty tanks. The German officers who had mocked American fuel convoys were either dead, captured, or in full retreat. Those who survived to write memoirs universally mentioned fuel as the critical failure. Generaloberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff, later testified at Nuremberg that the Ardennes offensive failed primarily due to fuel shortages. We calculated that captured American fuel would sustain our advance. This proved catastrophically wrong. The Americans destroyed their supplies rather than let them fall into our hands. Our own fuel reserves were inadequate from the start. By the 5th day, the offensive was doomed, though fighting continued for weeks. But the Ardennes was merely the most dramatic example of American logistics dominance. The same pattern held throughout the European theatre. In August 1944, Patton's Third Army had raced across France so quickly that it temporarily outran its fuel supplies. The famous gas drought that stopped Third Army near the Moselle River in early September was not a failure of the logistics system. It was a deliberate allocation decision. Supreme Headquarters decided to prioritise fuel for Montgomery's market garden operation in the Netherlands. Once that operation concluded, Third Army's fuel deliveries resumed at full capacity. Within days, Patton was advancing again. The temporary fuel shortage became part of Patton's legend. "My men can eat their belts, but my tank's got to have gas," he supposedly said, though the quote may be apocryphal. What's documented is that Patton personally visited supply depots, met with logistics officers, and arranged unofficial fuel requisitions that bent regulations. Some historians call it scrounging, others call it theft. Patton called it winning. The important point is that even during the worst supply crisis of the European campaign, American armies had more fuel available than the German army had at any point after 1943. The secret to American fuel logistics wasn't just production volume, it was system redundancy and flexibility. If a truck convoy couldn't get through, pipeline delivery continued. If pipelines were damaged, coastal tankers brought fuel forward. If interdiction threatened ground transportation, barrage balloons and fighter cover protected the routes. If a fuel dump was destroyed, another was established within days. The system absorbed losses that would have crippled any other military and kept functioning without interruption. The engineering behind this system was extraordinary. Consider the cross-channel pipeline, codenamed Operation PLUTO, pipeline under the ocean. British and American engineers laid multiple pipelines across the English Channel, eventually delivering over 1 million gallons daily directly to France. The pipelines ran on the sea floor 20 to 40 miles long, pumping high-octane gasoline at pressures up to 1,500 pounds per square inch. German intelligence knew about PLUTO but couldn't interdict it. U-boats couldn't reach the heavily defended channels. Luftwaffe aircraft couldn't damage submerged pipelines. The fuel flowed continuously. On land, the pipeline division of the US Army Corps of Engineers laid over 8,000 miles of pipeline across Europe between June 1944 and May 1945. That's the distance from New York to Hawaii. These weren't permanent installations. They were tactical pipelines, often laid above ground or in shallow trenches, designed to be installed quickly and maintained with minimal resources. Standard sections were 20 feet long, coupled with quick connect fittings that a 3-man crew could assemble in minutes. Pumping stations, prefabricated and trailer-mounted, could be positioned every 30 miles to maintain pressure. The entire system could extend 20 miles per day as armies advanced. The pipeline crews were combat engineers who worked under fire. German artillery specifically targeted pipeline sections when located. Luftwaffe fighters strafed the conspicuous above-ground runs. Saboteurs attempted to blow connections. The engineers simply repaired damage and continued extending the lines. A hit pipeline section could be replaced in hours. Pumping stations were mobile and could be repositioned if threatened. The fuel kept flowing. German logistics officers studied captured American supply documents with increasing despair. The bureaucracy alone was overwhelming. Requisition forms, transportation requests, fuel allocation orders, maintenance schedules, delivery manifests, consumption reports. Every gallon of fuel was tracked through multiple levels of documentation. It seemed impossibly complex and wasteful. What the Germans didn't appreciate was that this paperwork enabled precise allocation. American logistics officers knew exactly how much fuel was in every dump, how much was in transit, how much each unit consumed, and how much reserve existed. They could project requirements weeks in advance and adjust deliveries in real time. The Germans, by contrast, often didn't know their own fuel status. Reports were delayed, incomplete, or falsified. Unit commanders hoarded fuel, not trusting higher headquarters to resupply. Black markets developed where fuel was traded for other supplies. Synthetic fuel plants overstated production to meet quotas. By late 1944, German fuel accounting was largely fiction. High command thought they had reserves that didn't exist. Units believed resupply was coming that never arrived. The entire system was collapsing under the weight of its own desperation. American abundance extended to fuel quality. The 100-octane gasoline used by Allied forces was far superior to the 87-octane fuel available to most German units. Higher octane allowed engines to run at higher compression ratios, producing more power. American truck engines designed for 80-octane civilian fuel ran beautifully on military 100-octane, actually exceeding their rated performance. German vehicles captured and pressed into Allied service often performed better on American fuel than they had on German fuel. The psychological impact of fuel abundance on American soldiers was significant. They never worried about running out. Trucks idled continuously because starting them consumed less fuel than the hassle of warm-up cycles in cold weather. Generators ran 24 hours a day, powering lights, radios, and heaters. Tanks conducted extended training exercises without concern for consumption. This created a mentality of mechanical confidence. Your vehicle would take you where you needed to go, bring you back, and be ready for the next mission. German soldiers, by contrast, constantly worried about fuel. Would their tank have enough for the next operation? Would the truck make it to the supply dump and back? This uncertainty eroded combat effectiveness. After the Ardennes offensive failed, German logistics entered terminal decline. Allied air attacks systematically destroyed synthetic fuel plants. By February 1945, German fuel production had dropped to 20% of 1944 levels. Entire panzer divisions sat immobile, training with horses because there was no fuel for vehicles. The Luftwaffe grounded most of its aircraft. Naval vessels stayed in port. When German units did receive fuel, it was often adulterated with substitutes that damaged engines and reduced power. The German military attempted creative solutions. They experimented with wood gas generators that converted wood chips to combustible gas, powering some vehicles. They researched alcohol fuels, coal dust slurries, even powdered lignite. Nothing worked at the scale required. Germany was a modern military force reverting to pre-industrial technology while facing an enemy with effectively unlimited resources. The end was inevitable. Only the timeline remained uncertain. The contrast was most stark in April 1945 during the final advance into Germany. American armoured divisions raced forward at speeds exceeding 50 miles per day, supported by fuel deliveries that never faltered. The truck convoys followed the advancing armour, sometimes taking wrong turns and ending up ahead of the front lines, but always keeping the tanks moving. German defenders, when they fought at all, did so with vehicles often abandoned for lack of fuel. Panzerfaust's handheld anti-tank weapons became the primary German anti-armour weapon because there was no fuel to move tanks or artillery. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered. Among the many factors contributing to defeat, fuel shortages ranked with air superiority and manpower losses as decisive. German generals writing memoirs after the war consistently cited fuel as the constraint that made victory impossible. Even tactical successes couldn't be exploited. Even strong defensive positions had to be abandoned. Even intact armoured units were useless without fuel. The final accounting of American logistics in the European theatre staggers the imagination. From D-Day to VE Day, approximately 370 days, the American military delivered 8 million tons of supplies to forces in Europe. Roughly 35% of that tonnage, 2.8 million tons, was fuel and lubricants. That's approximately 750 million gallons of gasoline and oil. The truck convoys alone covered over 200 million miles, equivalent to driving to the sun and back, delivering these supplies. The Red Ball Express operated for 83 days and delivered 412,000 tons of cargo, over half of it fuel. The human cost of maintaining this system was significant but rarely mentioned. Truck drivers died in accidents on icy mountain roads. Pipeline crews were killed by artillery fire. Supply depot guards were overrun in German attacks. The men who kept the fuel flowing paid in blood, though their casualties were far lower than infantry or armour units. Approximately 200 Transportation Corps soldiers died in the European theatre, most in vehicle accidents rather than combat. By comparison, German losses in just the Ardennes offensive exceeded 80,000 killed or captured. The technological legacy of American wartime logistics transformed post-war transportation. The standardized truck designs, the pipeline technology, the traffic control systems, the inventory management techniques all found civilian applications. The interstate highway system, begun in the 1950s, was explicitly justified as necessary for national defense, using lessons learned from wartime supply operations. The containerized shipping that dominates modern logistics traces its origins to military standardization of cargo handling. Modern supply chain management, with its emphasis on just-in-time delivery and continuous tracking, evolved from wartime necessity. At the United States Army Transportation Museum at Fort Eustis, Virginia, a restored GMC Jimmy sits in the place of honor, representing the thousands of vehicles that kept armies mobile. The museum's displays include jerry cans, pipeline sections, traffic control signs from the Red Ball Express, and fuel allocation documents. One exhibit features a simple calculation written on a weathered piece of paper, supposedly created by an unknown logistics sergeant in December 1944. 1 gallon of gas moves 1 truck 5 miles. 1 truck carries 400 gallons. 1 gallon delivered to the front travels 5 miles and delivers 400 gallons that will move tanks 4 miles each, times 100 tanks equals 400 miles of tank movement from 1 gallon invested in delivery. That's why we never run out. The mathematics were more complex than that sergeant's calculation, but the principle was sound. American logistics accepted inefficiency at the operational level because strategic abundance made it irrelevant. German logistics sought maximum efficiency because scarcity demanded it. In the end, wasteful abundance defeated careful efficiency, because abundance could sustain operations indefinitely, while efficiency eventually hit resource limits that no amount of careful planning could overcome. The German officers who mocked American fuel convoys in December 1944 learned a terrible lesson. The real strength of those convoys wasn't the trucks, or the fuel, or even the roads. It was the industrial system behind them, the economic capacity that could produce and deliver supplies on a scale that made mockery irrelevant. Those convoys represented American power in its most elemental form, raw material superiority so overwhelming that tactical brilliance couldn't overcome it. The trucks kept rolling, the fuel kept flowing, and German laughter turned to silence in frozen forests, where abandoned panzers sat like tombstones, their tanks empty, their war over. The German fuel crisis that doomed the Ardennes offensive didn't emerge suddenly in December 1944. It was the culmination of systemic failures that began years earlier, failures that American intelligence had identified and exploited with ruthless efficiency. Understanding how the United States recognized and targeted German fuel vulnerabilities reveals a dimension of strategic warfare that often gets overshadowed by tales of tactical combat. This was industrial warfare at its most sophisticated, where petroleum engineers and logistics planners wielded weapons as devastating as any bomber formation. In 1940, Germany imported 85% of its oil, primarily from Romania. The German military consumed approximately 60 million barrels annually for training and combat operations. Domestic production contributed barely 5 million barrels. The synthetic fuel program, converting coal to gasoline through the Fischer-Tropsch process, produced another 15 million barrels. The math was simple and terrifying. Germany needed 60 million barrels annually. It could produce 20 million domestically. The 40 million barrel shortfall had to come from imports, primarily Romanian oil fields at Ploiești. The German High Command understood this vulnerability from the beginning. Protecting Romanian oil and expanding synthetic fuel production became strategic priorities second only to winning battles. By 1943, Germany had invested billions of Reichsmarks in synthetic fuel plants. 12 major production facilities, along with dozens of smaller refineries, were scattered across Germany and occupied territories. At peak production in early 1944, these plants produced approximately 45 million barrels annually when combined with natural petroleum from Romania. This still wasn't enough, but it was close to sustainable. The American Air Force understood that synthetic fuel plants were Germany's Achilles heel. Unlike dispersed natural oil fields that were difficult to damage from the air, synthetic fuel plants were concentrated industrial facilities with complex equipment that couldn't be quickly replaced. Destroy the plants, and Germany's entire war machine would grind to a halt, regardless of how many tanks they built or soldiers they trained. The campaign against German oil began in earnest in May 1944 with Operation Chattanooga Choo Choo, though it was officially designated as part of the broader combined bomber offensive. The first major raid targeted the lunar synthetic fuel plant near Merseburg on May 12, 1944. Over 800 American bombers dropped 1,500 tons of high explosives on the facility. The damage was catastrophic. Production dropped from 4,000 tons of fuel daily to fewer than 200 tons. German repair crews worked frantically, and within 3 weeks had restored partial production. The Americans returned on May 28th with another massive raid, then again on May 29th, and June 20th, and July 7th. The pattern continued through summer and fall of 1944. Every time Luna approached operational capacity, another bomber stream appeared overhead. The mathematical destruction was relentless. Each raid didn't need to destroy the plant completely, it just needed to damage critical components faster than they could be repaired. High-pressure distillation columns, catalytic crackers, cooling systems, electrical generators. These specialized components took months to manufacture and install. A single 500-pound bomb in the right location could shut down production for weeks. The Americans dropped thousands of bombs on each raid, ensuring multiple critical hits. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, later wrote that the oil campaign was Germany's death sentence. In his Spandau diary he noted, "The American bombing of our fuel plants was the single most effective operation of the entire air war. Everything else we could replace or work around. Destroyed factories could be dispersed, lost aircraft could be rebuilt, dead workers could be replaced with slave labor. But we could not make fuel without the plants, and we could not protect the plants from American bombers." By September 1944, German fuel production had dropped to 30% of January levels. Pilot training was cut to minimize fuel consumption. New pilots reached combat units with barely 30 hours of flight time, compared to over 200 hours for American pilots. Panzer divisions allocated to defensive positions couldn't maneuver to meet threats because there was no fuel for movement. The Luftwaffe conserved its remaining fuel for a decisive battle that never came because they couldn't accumulate enough reserves to make a decisive commitment. The impact cascaded through every level of the German military. Tactical commanders couldn't execute planned operations because there was no fuel for the preliminary movements. Operational commanders couldn't shift reserves because there was no fuel for strategic redeployments. Strategic planners couldn't design offensives because every calculation started with inadequate fuel allocations. The entire German military became progressively paralyzed, not because units lacked combat power, but because they couldn't move that power to where it was needed. The Ardennes offensive represented Germany's attempt to break this stranglehold through operational audacity. If they could capture Antwerp, they would deny the Allies their primary port, creating a logistics crisis for the Americans while buying Germany time to restore fuel production. It was a desperate gamble based on optimistic assumptions about capturing American fuel supplies. The failure of those assumptions doomed the offensive before it began. What makes the German fuel calculations particularly tragic is that they were based on accurate intelligence about American supply operations. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed the massive fuel dumps. Interrogated American prisoners confirmed that supplies were abundant and lightly guarded. Captured documents detailed supply routes and depot locations. The intelligence was correct. What German planners failed to anticipate was American ruthlessness in destroying their own supplies rather than allowing capture. This policy of denial through destruction had been established months earlier during the breakout from Normandy. As American armoured divisions raced across France in August 1944, logistics planners recognized that any fuel dump in danger of capture had to be destroyed immediately. The calculation was coldly pragmatic. Replacing destroyed fuel cost money and time, but these were resources America had in abundance. Allowing Germany to capture fuel gave them the one resource they lacked. Therefore, destruction was always preferable to capture. The standing orders were explicit and distributed to every supply unit. If German forces approached within 10 miles of a fuel depot, begin preparations for demolition. If they reached within 5 miles, initiate controlled burning. If they were within 1 mile, destroy everything immediately by any means necessary. Guards at supply dumps carried thermite grenades specifically designed to ignite fuel. Demolition charges were pre-positioned at major depots. In some cases, artillery units had pre-registered coordinates for friendly supply dumps, ready to shell them if other destruction methods failed. The policy worked exactly as designed during the Ardennes offensive. As German spearheads advanced, American supply units executed demolitions with mechanical precision. At Stavelot alone, the 2.5 million gallons, destroyed would have fueled the entire German offensive for several additional days. Across the battle area, approximately 8 million gallons of American fuel were destroyed to prevent capture. This represented less than 2 weeks of American supply deliveries, but would have represented nearly 6 months of German production at December 1944 output levels. The psychological impact on German commanders was devastating. They had based their entire operational plan on capturing American supplies, and now watched helplessly as those supplies literally went up in smoke before their eyes. Pieper's radio messages to headquarters grew increasingly desperate. Request emergency fuel delivery. All captured dumps destroyed. Cannot advance further without resupply. The responses were equally desperate. No fuel available. Continue advance. Capture intact supplies. The German logistics system attempted to support the offensive, but the effort revealed how completely it had collapsed. Fuel convoys assembled in the rear areas were targeted by Allied fighter bombers as soon as they moved toward the front. American P-47 Thunderbolts, freed from escort duties by weather that grounded strategic bombers, prowled the roads hunting German vehicles. The same aircraft that had been mocked as flying milk bottles in 1943 were now the terror of German supply lines. A single flight of 4 P-47s could destroy an entire fuel convoy in minutes, their 8 machine guns per aircraft shredding unarmoured trucks and igniting fuel loads. The weather that initially favoured German operations by grounding Allied aircraft was temporary. By December 23rd, the skies cleared, and American air power descended on the Ardennes with apocalyptic fury. Over 5,000 sorties on December 24th alone, attacking everything that moved. German fuel trucks, already scarce, became nearly extinct. Drivers abandoned vehicles at the first sound of aircraft engines, knowing that fighting through an attack was suicide. The few convoys that reached forward areas often arrived with half their vehicles destroyed and the remainder damaged. German attempts to use horse-drawn transport for fuel delivery failed catastrophically. Fuel in jerry cans could be loaded onto wagons, but the rate of delivery was absurdly slow. A truck could carry 400 gallons and travel 200 miles in a day. A horse-drawn wagon could carry perhaps 50 gallons and travel 20 miles in a day. The Wehrmacht had regressed to 19th century logistics while facing a 20th century enemy. Meanwhile, the American supply system was achieving feats that seemed impossible even by their own standards. On December 23rd, the same day Allied air power returned, General Patton's Third Army executed its relief of Bastogne. The operation required Patton's forces to pivot 90 degrees, move over 100 miles through terrible weather, and attack a reinforced German flank. The fuel requirements were staggering. Combat divisions consumed fuel at accelerated rates during offensive operations. Artillery units firing in support burned fuel powering prime movers and ammunition trucks. Even infantry divisions, normally low fuel consumers, needed fuel for jeeps, trucks, and weapons carriers supporting the attack. Third Army's fuel consumption during the relief of Bastogne exceeded 500,000 gallons daily. That's 500,000 gallons delivered through winter storms, on secondary roads, through territory that had seen heavy combat just days earlier. The Red Ball Express and supporting supply units accomplished this by running convoys 24 hours a day, accepting accident rates that would have been considered unacceptable in peacetime, and improvising solutions to every obstacle. When a bridge collapsed under the weight of a heavily loaded fuel truck, engineers built a bypass ford through a partially frozen stream. Trucks drove through 2 feet of icy water, their drivers hoping engines wouldn't stall in mid-crossing. When roads became impassable due to snow, bulldozers from engineering units cleared paths, sometimes working under German artillery fire. When traffic jams developed, military police physically lifted and moved vehicles to create flow. The determination to keep fuel moving bordered on fanatical because everyone understood that stopping meant soldiers died. The soldiers receiving these supplies often had no idea of the effort required to deliver them. A tank crew refueling from jerry cans brought up by supply sergeants didn't see the convoy that had driven through the night to deliver those cans. They didn't know about the trucks that skidded off icy roads, the drivers who froze in unheated cabs, or the supply sergeants who worked through exhaustion to keep the chain moving. They just knew that when they needed fuel, it appeared. This reliability was itself a weapon, creating confidence that enabled aggressive operations. The German experience was exactly opposite. Panzer crews waiting for fuel that never arrived grew increasingly demoralized. Officers made promises they knew they couldn't keep. Fuel convoy arriving tonight. Fuel convoy arriving tomorrow. Fuel convoy delayed but definitely coming. Eventually the crews stopped believing. The psychological impact was corrosive. You could have the best tank in the world, but if it sat immobile for lack of fuel, you were defenceless. By January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge had cost Germany approximately 100,000 casualties and nearly 800 armoured vehicles. Many of those vehicles were abandoned intact, their crews simply walking away when fuel ran out and no rescue appeared possible. American recovery units collected hundreds of German tanks, assault guns and half-tracks, many in perfect working condition, except for empty fuel tanks. Some were evaluated for intelligence purposes, others were used for training. A few were actually pressed into American service, fueled with captured German stocks or American fuel, and used in combat against their former owners. The final humiliation came in March 1945 during Operation Lumberjack, the American crossing of the Rhine River at Remagen. When American advance units captured the Ludendorff Bridge intact on March 7th, German commanders ordered immediate counterattacks to destroy the bridge and eliminate the bridgehead. Multiple panzer divisions were designated for the counterattack. Few could move. The 11th Panzer Division had tanks but no fuel. The Panzer Lehr Division had fuel but no tanks, their armour having been destroyed in previous fighting. The 9th Panzer Division had neither. German units that did reach the Remagen area arrived piecemeal, without heavy equipment, and were destroyed by American forces that had crossed the Rhine in strength. American forces expanding the Remagen bridgehead consumed enormous quantities of fuel, pushing inland against desperate German resistance. Supply units established fuel depots on the east bank of the Rhine within 48 hours of the initial crossing. Within a week, pipelines were being laid across the river. The American ability to establish complete logistics infrastructure in a newly captured area, under fire, while maintaining offensive operations demonstrated mastery of mechanized warfare that the Germans could no longer match. The contrast between American and German logistics capabilities by spring 1945 was almost comical, if it weren't so tragic. American divisions advanced with mobile supply columns that included fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, maintenance vehicles, and even mobile kitchens. German divisions retreated with whatever they could carry, often abandoning vehicles that simply ran out of fuel. American units radioed for supplies and received them within hours. German units radioed for supplies and received apologies or silence. In April 1945, as American and Soviet forces closed in from east and west, the German fuel situation achieved a state that can only be described as non-existent. Synthetic fuel plants were either destroyed or in Soviet-occupied territory. Romanian oil fields had been lost months earlier. Stockpiles were exhausted. Some German units were literally siphoning fuel from abandoned vehicles to keep a few critical vehicles mobile. Others had converted trucks to run on wood gas, a desperate expedient that reduced power output by 60% and required constant maintenance. The final German fuel statistics tell the story of complete industrial collapse. In January 1944, Germany produced 3.8 million barrels of fuel. In January 1945, production was 0.6 million barrels. By April 1945, production was essentially zero. The American air campaign against oil had achieved exactly what planners intended. The German military was immobilized not because soldiers stopped fighting, but because vehicles stopped running. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended. American supply units that day delivered approximately 1.2 million gallons of fuel to forward areas, maintaining their operational rhythm despite the cessation of combat. The system that had sustained armies through 11 months of continuous operations from Normandy to the Elbe River kept functioning because that's what it was designed to do. German fuel production that day was zero. The system that had struggled to sustain operations since 1943 had finally achieved total collapse. Post-war analysis by American military historians identified fuel logistics as one of the three decisive factors in Allied victory, alongside air superiority and intelligence advantages. German historians generally agreed, though they debated whether better German logistics could have changed the outcome. The consensus, even among German analysts, was that American industrial capacity was so overwhelming that German defeat was inevitable. Better logistics might have prolonged the war but couldn't have prevented the ultimate result. The lessons learned from the fuel campaign influenced American military doctrine for decades. The importance of logistics redundancy, the value of standardization, the necessity of protecting supply lines, and the wisdom of destroying supplies rather than allowing capture all became foundational principles. Modern American military logistics, with its emphasis on pre-positioning, rapid deployment, and overwhelming sustainability, traces directly to World War II experiences. The German officers who survived the war and wrote memoirs universally acknowledged that mocking American supply operations had been foolish arrogance. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, the architect of German panzer tactics, wrote in his memoirs, "We criticized American logistics as wasteful and inefficient. We were correct about the waste, but wrong about the efficiency. Their system delivered what was needed, when it was needed, in quantities we could never match. Our efficiency was the efficiency of poverty. Their waste was the waste of abundance. In war, abundance wins." The mechanics of how America achieved this abundance remained impressive decades later. The coordination required to move millions of tons of supplies across thousands of miles involved thousands of people making millions of decisions. Traffic controllers routing convoys, supply sergeants tracking inventory, engineers maintaining roads and pipelines, mechanics repairing vehicles, drivers hauling loads through exhaustion. Each person was a component in a machine that functioned with reliability, that combat operations depended on absolutely. The truck drivers of the Red Ball Express, the pipeline engineers, the supply depot guards, the maintenance crews, these men weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They didn't storm beaches or charge machine gun nests. But they enabled every victory through unglamorous, exhausting work that never stopped. When historians write about American victory in Europe, they focus on dramatic battles and charismatic generals. The supply sergeants who ensured those battles could be fought rarely get mentioned. Yet their contribution was absolutely essential. The final accounting shows just how complete American logistics dominance was. From June 1944 to May 1945, American forces in Europe consumed approximately 750 million gallons of fuel. German forces defending Europe consumed approximately 150 million gallons, most of it in the first 6 months before production collapsed. The ratio was 5-1. Add in the reality that American forces were conducting offensive operations requiring higher fuel consumption, while German forces were mostly defending requiring less fuel, and the disparity becomes even more striking. If you include the Pacific Theater, where American forces were conducting simultaneous operations across an even larger area, the numbers become almost absurd. Total American military fuel consumption during World War II exceeded 7 billion gallons. Total German consumption was approximately 2 billion gallons across 6 years. The United States consumed more fuel in 1944 alone than Germany consumed during the entire war. These numbers represented more than industrial capacity. They represented a fundamental difference in how the two nations understood mechanized warfare. Germany saw fuel as a constraint to be managed carefully, allocating scarce resources to priority operations and accepting that many units would be immobile. America saw fuel as a tool to be used aggressively, ensuring every unit could maneuver at maximum capacity and accepting inefficiency as the cost of overwhelming mobility. The German approach made sense for a nation with limited resources. Careful allocation, efficient use, and conservation of scarce supplies were rational responses to scarcity. The problem was that careful resource management couldn't compete with unlimited resource availability. American commanders never worried about fuel efficiency because they never had to. The supply system delivered whatever was needed, and if operations required wasteful consumption, the system simply delivered more. This abundance cascaded through every level of operations, creating advantages that accumulated into overwhelming superiority. American tanks could maneuver freely while German tanks conserved fuel. American trucks could idle continuously while German trucks shut down to save fuel. American aircraft could fly training missions while German aircraft sat grounded. The cumulative effect of thousands of small advantages was strategic paralysis for Germany and strategic freedom for America. The German officers who mocked American fuel convoys never understood that those convoys were the physical manifestation of American industrial might. Each truck represented manufacturing capacity Germany couldn't match. Each gallon represented production Germany couldn't achieve. Each mile driven represented infrastructure Germany couldn't replicate. The convoys weren't a weakness to be exploited. They were strength incarnate, rolling forward with mechanical inevitability. When Kampfgruppe, Piper watched American fuel dumps burning at Stavelot. They witnessed the ultimate expression of that strength. America could afford to burn millions of gallons rather than allow capture, because millions more were already in transit. Germany couldn't afford to lose a single truck of fuel because replacements didn't exist. That disparity, more than any battle or campaign, determined the war's outcome. The thunder of approaching American supply convoys became the soundtrack of German defeat. That distinctive rumble of hundreds of trucks, the sound of abundance in motion, meant American armies could fight where they chose, when they chose, with whatever force they deemed necessary. German armies could only react, constrained always by lack of fuel, watching their options narrow, until finally there were no options left except surrender. The fuel never ran out because America never allowed it to run out. Production, transportation, distribution, protection, redundancy, all orchestrated into a system that functioned despite losses, despite challenges, despite everything the enemy could do to stop it. The German officers learned too late that you cannot mock what you cannot stop, and you cannot stop what you cannot even comprehend. American fuel logistics weren't just superior. They were categorically different, operating on a scale and with efficiency that rendered German efforts irrelevant. In the end, the Germans didn't lose because they fought poorly. They lost because they ran out of gas. And America made certain they could never get more.